So today's plenary, this is the third plenary of the conference and the last one actually, so it's great to have you all here for the third and final plenary of CiviCon, the title is Democratic Backsliding, Illiberal Movements and Resistance Alternatives. Today we have two very special speakers, Cristina Fominaya, PhD of University of California, Berkeley. She's an internationally recognized expert in European and global social movements and politics and Professor of Global Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark. She is Editor-in-Chief of Social Movement Studies Journal and co-founder of Interface. She has published and edited widely in the area of social movements and democratic innovation, including her book on Spain's transformative pro-democracy movement, Democracy Reloaded, 2020, Oxford University Press. She speaks regularly to audiences around the world on social movements, human rights, and democracy. Our next speaker is Nayia Kamenou, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Cyprus. She completed a joint Bachelor of Arts in Honours in Political Science at the City University of New York and a Master of Science in Human Rights at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's a PhD in European Studies at King's College London. Prior to joining the University of Cyprus as a lecturer, she worked as a senior lecturer at the deputy director of the Media Discourse Centre at De Montfort University, Leicester. In 2021, Dr. Kamenou received the International Political Science Association Wilmer Rule Award for the best research on gender and politics. We're very lucky to have them both here today. And our moderator for the day is Erman Dolmacı. Over to you, Erman. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, welcome to the third plenary session of the CiviCon conference. I hope you are enjoying the second day after a very inspiring speech by Professor Donatella. I would like to share that I have this great pleasure to moderate this session with two distinguished academicians, Professor Cristina Fominaya and Dr. Nayia Kamenou. In this session, we will be focusing on the CiviCon's third thematic focus area, which is democratic backsliding, anti-freedom movements, and alternative forms of resistance. In this session, we will be asking the questions, how can civil society resist illiberal and anti-rights mobilization that distort democratic tools? And also, what new strategies can develop to defend pluralism, rights, and freedom? You can further read about the questions and the thematic focus description on the page 11 of the conference booklet as well. And before taking up too much time of our speakers, I would like to briefly introduce Professor Cristina's presentation. So she will be presenting Caring Democracy, the Commons, and Polarization in the context of democratic backsliding and the rise of authoritarianism. Professor Fominaya will propose a rethinking of polarization in the context of democratic backsliding and the rise of authoritarianism, and call for substantive, overall procedural understanding of democracy based on commons thinking and caring democracy. The floor is yours.
Günaydın. Ne yaparsınız? Thank you so much for this warm welcome and invitation to speak with you today in this beautiful space. It's çok güzel. And it's so important to provide spaces where we can openly discuss these difficult issues. I also want to give a special thank you to the interpreters who are doing such an amazing job. So in my talk today, first I want to offer some insight into backsliding and polarization before moving on to how social movements can work and innovate for democracy. Now, when we think about democratic backsliding, we often think about the rise of authoritarian and far-right political leaders. And when we think about polarization, we usually think about a loss of common ground between two opposing ideological poles. We think of partisan differences, we think of left and right, we think of far left and far right, we think of political parties, citizens, and voters. We also think about these primarily in the context of specific nation states. But today I would like us to consider some other forms of backsliding and a different way to think about polarization, which to my mind are crucial for understanding the scenario in which we find ourselves. Indeed, there is a gulf between ideological options and orientations, which is currently becoming more clearly than ever, a gulf between those that defend democratic values, principles, mechanisms, and institutions, and those that do not, even as they say they do. But I would argue that polarization doesn't just come down to fundamental partisan or ideological differences, and that another axis of polarization is taking place between political leaders and aligned establishment institutions on the one hand, and a large part of public opinion and grassroots progressive mobilization on the other, around key issues and crises. With regard to backsliding, while of course democratic backsliding is more striking and severe in some cases where, for example, outright neo-fascists or authoritarians are leading governments, the issue of backsliding is not limited to right-wing or far right-wing actors. To paraphrase Waldner and Lust, democratic backsliding is a process of restricting participation without explicitly abolishing elections, and of loosening the constraints of accountability by eroding norms of answerability and punishment, where answerability means the requirement of officials to publicize and justify their actions, and punishment refers to the capacity of either citizens or governing agencies to impose negative consequences for undesirable actions or violations. Put another way, for my purposes here, it means restricting participation by restricting the right to freedom of assembly, association, and expression, and actively eroding the legitimacy and viability of the rule of law and democratic institutions, in part by neglecting to sanction or punish violations of norms and laws. Bearing this in mind, Western leaders of democracies of all political stripes have demonstrated over the past 2 years that they share a clear responsibility for democratic backsliding, notably in the context of the Israel-Palestine crisis. And in this context, they have done this in several ways, which I'll tell you now. They have failed to uphold their responsibilities under international law to act to prevent genocide as required to do so by the Genocide Convention. They have ignored or challenged global governance institutions such as the International Criminal Court, which they have an obligation to collaborate with under the Statute of Rome, or the United Nations International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. They have ignored or attempted to silence UN representatives and experts, such as Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, who has produced 2 comprehensive reports documenting the genocide in detail, or Michael Fakhri, Special Rapporteur for Food Security, who has documented the starvation campaign that Israel has carried out against the Palestinian people, a campaign that is long-standing but has become increasingly acute since October 2023, and which has left 2.2 million Palestinians with, quote, acute food insecurity, close quote. When Israel accused UNRWA, without presenting any evidence, of being an organization that supported terrorists, the US, the EU, Sweden, Germany, Switzerland, Canada, UK, Netherlands, Australia, Italy, New Zealand, Iceland, and Finland joined in a material and reputational attack on UNRWA and withheld their funding, a decision that the organization Jewish Voice for Peace called a heinous act of genocide, and critics called a form of collective punishment of desperate, destitute, and hungry Palestinians. The ICJ has determined Israel's allegations were unfounded and the blocking of aid illegal. In many cases, Western governments have been actively complicit in genocide, sending funding, arms, and staunchly defending Israel's right to defend itself, even when that defense entailed war crimes such as shooting children in the head, as reported by the BBC, or using internationally banned white phosphorus, according to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, among many other confirmed atrocities. In the United Kingdom, over 800 lawyers signed a letter advising Starmer's government that their complicity was illegal under international law. When states violate international law by aligning with, defending, and supporting states that are committing war crimes, crimes that have been live-streamed to the Global Court of Public Opinion for over 2 years, this erodes the very foundations of democracy. It contributes to democratic backsliding by making a mockery of international law and human rights, eroding the legitimacy and belief in democratic institutions, and creates the sensation that by ignoring the findings of courts and experts, government leaders are gaslighting their own citizens. But the erosion of democracy doesn't stop there. As Israel crossed red line after red line, as journalists and aid workers were murdered, as hospitals and doctors were bombed, as the testimonies of atrocities piled up, and as the evidence of our own eyes showed us the horror of what was and is happening, citizens and democracies across the world wondered why their leaders were failing to act. In the face of this, people have responded by protesting en masse and by speaking out. The global protest tracker ACLED documented 32,000 demonstrations between October 7, 2023 and 31st October 2024 related to this conflict, of which 92% were pro-Palestinian and/or pro-Lebanon. An astonishing 1 in 5 protests in the world in this period were related to this conflict. Students set up camps across universities. Academics, lawyers, and NGOs have spoken out, campaigned, and provide expert testimony and analysis. Activists have tried to break the inhumane blockade by delivering food and aid directly by land and by sea, trying to do what their governments have failed to do. When citizens protested, instead of listening and supporting them, many Western leaders moved to criminalize peaceful protest and solidarity, further contributing to democratic backsliding by denying their own citizens their fundamental rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. In Germany, for example, the European Legal Support Center has documented over 776 cases of repression against people expressing solidarity with Palestinians or protesting against the genocide in Palestine, covering a wide array of actions and targets, including raiding homes, banning events, arresting protesters, arresting journalists, and threatening the UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territories with documented cases of police brutality. In the United States, even before the authoritarian attacks on the government by the Trump administration, and in Canada, we saw universities repressing and silencing students and faculty who spoke against complicity with Israel's war crimes, a situation that has further intensified under the Trump regime. In the United Kingdom, the government has become a laughingstock, despite the seriousness of their actions, for responding to criticisms that they are complicit in genocide by taking the unprecedented decision to proscribe direct action group Palestine Action as a terrorist organization. This has led to widespread media coverage of British police arresting 80-year-old pacifists on suspicion of terror offenses for holding signs reading, "I am against genocide, I support Palestine Action." People on social media in the UK point out that being complicit in genocide is government policy, but opposing genocide is not only illegal, but classed as terrorism. At what point does opposing genocide not only become a criminal offense, but an act of terrorism? These are not strong indicators of a robust and thriving democracy. In all these democratic contexts, we have seen serious indications of democratic backsliding. As most Western leaders and the EU leadership staunchly defended and/or supported Israel, polling data has shown that global public opinion moving steadily in the opposite direction, even in countries with the strongest support for Israel and the greatest levels of repression against solidarity for Palestine and critique of the government of Israel's actions. While figures vary across Western nations, a significant and increasing percentage of public opinion expresses some level of concern or opposition to Israel's actions in Gaza and a variance to their government's positions and responses to this conflict. There are many more examples of backsliding I could offer, but this case highlights that there is a strong continuity across ideological lines, from conservatives to liberals to labor governments, contributing to democratic backsliding. They have loosened the constraints of accountability by eroding norms of answerability and punishment, granting impunity to a state committing war crimes, and they have restricted the participation of citizens who have objected to this. So to come back to the notion of polarization, we have on the one hand established political parties and the EU working to actively erode democracy on this issue, and on the other, a majority of citizens on and off the streets who oppose these attacks on democracy and the rule of law. On this issue, at least, there seems to be stronger polarization between citizens and their elected representatives than between ideological poles in the public sphere. This issue shows that democratic backsliding is not only due to far-right or explicit anti-democratic forces, but that governments of all stripes are rapidly eroding the norms and dismantling the institutional structures that enable us to resist authoritarianism and further democratic backsliding. If we move beyond this particular case, we can also see other troubling trends, such as the consistent normalization of far-right authoritarian discourses, especially those that promote xenophobia and racism, often in the context of debates about immigration, but certainly not limited to that sphere. These have been promoted by political parties of all stripes as they chase the far-right votes, a dangerous game that works only to increase the appeal of the far-right rather than lessen it. In the face of this very troubling scenario of democratic backsliding, then, and the rise of the far-right and authoritarianism, what can social movements do? An Open Society Foundation global survey conducted in 2023 showed that citizen trust in civil society organizations is currently stronger than trust in governance institutions globally. So the role of progressive mobilization in the strengthening of democracy is potentially great. Witnessing the genocide in Gaza, or witnessing the raids on Black and brown people in the United States by ICE agents, who are masked, armed government agents, whether these things are witnessed directly or through media, causes what are known as moral shocks. In contexts where dissent is silenced or punished, people who are opposed to what their governments are doing or to what their governments, employers, or communities are silencing can also feel isolated and alienated, leading to self-censorship, depression, and other forms of social malaise. So here, social movements can play an important role. Witnessing protests can play a role in overcoming the sense of alienation, isolation, and hopelessness that moral shocks can cause. When only exposed to hegemonic narratives that, for example, normalize and justify war crimes and violations of human rights, people tend to underestimate the perceptions of other people, thinking that they alone care about these issues. And this is what is known as a spiral of silence. Now, research has shown that unpopular regimes and unpopular policies persist in part because people underestimate other people's opposition to them. Exposure to protests, however, can change people's views about what other members of society think. So protests can play an important role in breaking through the sense of isolation and alienation in repressive contexts. And by repressive, I'm including here democratic contexts in which governments are actively contributing to democratic backsliding. Because these protests can demonstrate that there is a wider community that shares democratic values, including solidarity, compassion, and commitments to universal rights, values and beliefs that might not be expressed within their families, within their friends, or institutional settings, in contexts where implicit or explicit pressures are silencing critical voices. And that silencing, of course, is another indicator of democratic backsliding. Social movements can also break the power of hegemonic narratives that clearly defy the evidence of people's own eyes. Even when people don't necessarily feel that they're being gaslit, social movements can work to contest hegemonic narratives and propose alternatives. For example, in the context of the post-2008 financial crash and austerity politics, one of the narratives coming from political leaders was that the crash was caused by people living beyond their means, rather than by the lack of regulation and oversight of the financial sectors and complicity between political and economic elites. The post-crash fallout was presented as a crisis for which no one was to blame. It was an abstract outcome of obscure market forces. The social movements of the squares contested this narrative. They argued that what had happened was not a crisis. It was a swindle, whereby politicians used the crisis as a way to impose austerity policies and defraud the public to benefit private financial interests. But they didn't only contest this narrative. They offered an alternative vision of democracy that didn't just involve citizens acting like consumers of this or that political party every few years, but calling for a genuine rebooting of democracy. They called for placing the interests of the common good and a politics of life over the politics of capital. They developed powerful master frames that challenged status quo understandings of politics and democracy. Participating in movements also develops networks that can provide an infrastructure and a set of skills and shared experiences and forms of organizing that can later be mobilized in different contexts. For example, social movement networks can engage in democratic innovation and can pivot to mobilize their expertise, knowledge, and experience in new crisis scenarios. In the context of the COVID pandemic, for example, in Taiwan, the close partnership between the government, activists, and civil society resulted in a highly effective response to COVID and was the result of the innovations of decentralized civic hacker communities advocating for open source and open government. And they played a key role in Taiwan's Sunflower movement in 2014. So here we see the hacker ethics and practices that were developed in that earlier pro-democracy movement being mobilized to strengthen democracy in response to a new crisis situation, which was the pandemic. Pro-democracy movements can make deep and lasting contributions that work against democratic backsliding. One of the most worrying characteristics of contemporary far-right discourse is the exaltation of white male supremacy, which combines a hatred of women and black and brown people with utter disdain for and lack of compassion for the poor or anyone constructed as weak. One of the hallmarks of this discourse is the classification of values into male and female, with the so-called stereotypical male values exalted as superior and the so-called female values despised as worthless. This is in part why empathy is seen as weakness in this narrative and cruelty is seen as strength. As Elon Musk said, voicing a well-established conservative talking point, quote, "The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy," close quote. At root, authoritarianism and far-right discourses are essentially about the politics of death. What do I mean by the politics of death? That sounds kind of extreme, but only until you really think about the consequences of the policies that are being advocated for. I'm referring to policies that deny or restrict people and the planet the conditions necessary to sustain life. Whether that means privatizing healthcare and condemning millions to succumb to disease in order to profit from sickness, denying the existence of climate change to justify continuing to accumulate profits from fossil fuels, denying a genocide unfolding in front of our eyes to justify making millions in arms sales and military technology, or denying the existence of gendered violence, which has reached the point where 1 in 3 women globally have experienced physical or sexual assault. It literally means, as Membe has written, determining who gets to live and who gets to die. And as Judith Butler has put it in her work on the frames of war, who has a grievable life and who doesn't? Who are we allowed to mourn and commemorate? Who gets to wage wars? Who gets to exercise violence with impunity? Who gets to live and who gets to die? Unfortunately, especially as far-right positions become normalized and mainstreamed, all too often these narratives are put forth by people across ideological lines. And these distinctions between categories of people do not just float in a vacuum. They are propagated through various institutional narratives and practices. In analysis of the BBC coverage of the conflict in Israel-Gaza, for example, despite the starkly asymmetrical nature of the conflict, with at least 34 times more Palestinian deaths, the BBC gave Israeli deaths 33 times more coverage than Palestinian deaths. A hierarchy of language was used to portray Israeli suffering as, quote, inherently more tragic, more deliberate, and more worthy of human empathy than Palestinian deaths, close quote. For example, Israelis were butchered, but Palestinians simply died. BBC headlines consistently obscured Israeli responsibility through the use of passive language, with no mention of the perpetrator. So, for example, the headline might read, "Airstrike on Gaza, school, kills at least 15 people." Who killed them? The New York Times followed similar patterns of coverage. And it's interesting to me that gendered violence is often reported with this passive language as well. Woman found dead, as opposed to woman murdered by husband or whatever. Now, all of the justifications that we're offered for these forms of violence rest on a system of othering, dehumanizing, and establishing hierarchies of worth. These discourses incite violence and justify violence and oppression, and therefore they must be contested everywhere we encounter them. I think we really need to think deeply about what democracy means in substantive terms. What are the values and aspirations that we have for it, rather than thinking of it in purely procedural terms? Being able to vote is not enough, and these examples of democratic backsliding show this very clearly. We need to be much more demanding and proactive about our democracies. So what can movements do, again? Let me just finish by giving you some specific examples from pro-democracy movements. One of the most important democratic impacts of Spain's 15M movement, which emerged after the 2008 crash and combined anti-austerity and pro-democracy activism, was the revitalization and promotion of feminism. Clearly, there is no real democracy without not just formal equality, but the full ability to exercise rights and freedoms for all women. Feminism starts from an analysis of patriarchy, but then develops and extends to encompass larger critiques and reflections on interlocking forms of oppression that stem from the same patriarchal logics that structure society. So, in the 15M movement, protest camps, such as the one in Madrid's Central Square, are mirrors of societies because they're an open environment in the middle of a city. That means anybody can come into that space, which is fantastic. But it was very clear early on that many of those people entering that space were bringing with them a lot of internalized sexism, including very serious misunderstandings of what feminism was with them. So feminists in the square realized that they had a lot of work to do. And feminists in Spain have managed to radically renew the social and political commitment to a feminist vision for society, by which I mean one that is based on women's liberation through dismantling patriarchy, certainly, but also on solidarity, care for citizens and the environment, collective self-empowerment, social and economic justice, and sustainable and responsible policies. The fight against sexist violence and other key issues, including LGBTQ rights, has been extremely powerful in Spain in the wake of the 15M movement. Now, much of this surge of activism flourished in the squares and was enabled by feminists' conscious decision to do two key things. First, they focused on what united them, rather than spending a lot of energy debating those issues that divided them. And there are deep issues that divide them as well. And the second thing was collectively engaging in active pedagogical work and consciousness raising within the movement. And I think we can learn so much from this approach today as we face a scenario where women's rights and human rights more broadly are being attacked and eroded. The feminist activists in 15M moved beyond critique to action. They were proactive. And today's Spanish government has passed some of the most progressive feminist legislation in the world. And this is directly traceable to the power of mobilizing in the 15M movement within and after the crash. So I think it's so important to remember, as this movement effectively demonstrated, that feminism is not just a women's issue, it's a fundamental democracy issue. Feminism is for everybody, as Bell Hooks put it. And it takes everybody to overcome oppressive systems, discourses, and structures. After all, misogyny is often expressed, advocated, and disseminated most explicitly and forcefully in spaces where women are not present. It is in those spaces where it is crucial that sexist and degrading narratives that justify violence and discrimination against women must be contested. Women and girls' lives are literally at stake. And of course, nobody is truly free unless everyone is free. Another core contribution of the 15M movement, and with this I finish, was the development of the notion of caring democracy, which integrates commons and feminist thinking. And as in Taiwan, what we saw there was that the feminist ethics and the legacy of 15M bore fruit in the context of the pandemic later on. Research by Diz, Esteves, and Martinez-Bujan has shown the lasting power of a caring democracy ethic, one that is committed to democratic renewal that focuses on sustaining life and the common good. They show how the democratic legacy of the 15M movement was renewed in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically through the creation of network groups of caring neighbors who adopted and adapted 15M ethics and practices to care for the most vulnerable in mutual aid groups. These groups drew on the feminist ethics of care to center vulnerability and interdependence in the context of the crisis. They also focused on socio-material practices such as mask making, resource mapping, and counseling as forms of direct provisions of care. These forms of direct collective self-empowerment and provision are connected to a vision of democracy that places caring at the center, and which is a legacy of the ecosystem of democratic innovation that 15M generated. I think the vision and practice of a caring democracy and the common good is one of the most powerful antidotes to democratic backsliding and to the toxic narratives of far-right authoritarian actors. Our political priorities must be to guarantee health, shelter, nutrition, and a life of dignity for all, which means protecting all forms of life and the conditions to sustain it. No real democratic life is possible without that. The road ahead is daunting and can feel overwhelming. It can seem that despite millions of people on the streets and speaking out, that nothing changes. But I hope to have shown you some of the power and impact protests and movements can have, even when it seems that nothing is shifting at the top of the power and decision-making structures. We can learn a lot from social movements working to strengthen our democracies, both from what they get right and what they can get wrong. And I'm so grateful for your attention, and I thank you so much for listening. Teşekkür ederim. Thank you.
Yesterday we received feedback that it was not possible to listen the speakers when it was singing, so yeah, we had a short break. Once again, thank you, Professor Fominaya, for very insightful contribution. I really like the concepts of spiral of silence, the politics of that, and the use of the language, as well as the concrete examples of solidarity and care in democracy. Thank you, and now we will continue with Dr. Nayia Kamenou. So her presentation title is Anti-Gender Politics in Cyprus, Discourses, Actors and Resistances. Dr. Kamenou will analyze the formation and spread of anti-gender and anti-LGBTIQ+ politics in Cyprus and shared preliminary findings on emerging forms of resistance, as well as the role of both supporting and opposing actors in these processes. The floor is yours, Dr. Kamenou.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important and timely endeavor that brings together scholars, researchers, and activists. Like many of you, I trust, I believe that the aim of our teaching and research should be striving to bridge the gap between academia and communities whose voice and participation is vital to understandings of the phenomena we try to analyze and change through our scholarship, research, and teaching. When I reread the abstract that I gave you for my presentation, I realized that I have been overly ambitious about what I could do during the next 30 minutes or so. And when I started writing this presentation, I realized that today I will raise more questions than answers, so please accept my apologies for this, and I hope you will allow me to contemplate with you questions that motivate my research on anti-gender politics in Cyprus. Before I embark with you on this journey, I think that some caveats are in order. First, what I will share with you today is based on preliminary and admittedly sketchy research conducted with the help of my amazing research assistants. As my funded project does not officially commence until December. Second, due to language and other restrictions, for the moment, I can only contemplate upon and talk about the situation in the south, although the plan is to study the situation in the north as well. So yeah, what I will try to do today, and I will need your help with it, is to problematize analytical tools employed in research on anti-gender politics and its theoretical conclusions vis-à-vis contexts that have not been sufficiently examined, like Cyprus. Before we do this, I think it's important to briefly discuss the extant research on anti-gender politics, and I will try to do that in the following steps. I will first focus on existing knowledge vis-à-vis transnational pro- and anti-gender politics. I will then discuss extant research findings about dangerous cooptations and misuses that was brought up by my colleague as well. Then I will highlight the importance of studying the national to understand the transnational and conclude by making a case about how research can be moved forward by examining the case of Cyprus. So the literature has convincingly made the argument that during the last decades, Europe has become a bastion of LGBTIQ+ rights, and that despite difficulties associated with particularities of national context, the Europeanization and transnationalization of LGBTIQ+ rights and advocacy have enabled LGBTIQ+ activism and the adoption of law and policy at the national level. However, others have pointed to the power asymmetries between European core and peripheries, and have argued that in some contexts, the mainstreaming of transnational LGBTIQ+ campaigns has overshadowed pre-existing queer political possibilities and restricts future ones, thus contributing to forms of exclusion and relational privilege among members of the LGBTIQ+ community across and within national borders. However, as we've already heard today from my esteemed colleagues, activism and politics and the dynamics between national and transnational LGBTIQ+ politics are not static. Additionally, their development is not always or necessarily linear towards substantive equality for and horizontal equality among all sexuality and gender non-conforming people, as homonationalism, which extends beyond the state apparatus and manifests itself among LGBTIQ+ groups indicates. So, despite disagreements about its effects in national context, the transnationalization of LGBTIQ+ rights discourses has lessened discrimination against community members, particularly in Europe. However, as we all have noticed, attempts at gender and LGBTIQ+ equality are being met with fierce resistance under the pretext of freedom of expression and of fighting against the destruction of the national family and human civilization. That's not part of my paper, it just occurred to me and I want to share it with you just in case you haven't heard. Recently, two MPs in the South submitted a proposal to the Parliament which essentially states that trans women should not be protected under the Istanbul Convention. And I close the parenthesis and I move on with my text. As Paternotte and Kuhar explained, until the late 2010s, anti-gender mobilization in Europe had received limited attention, although it has been developing since the early 2010s. As they explain, this is partly the result of the predominance of a teleological account of gender and sexual politics in the region, namely by the assumption that gender and LGBTIQ+ equality is a progressive, unstoppable, and irreversible process. As they further explain, anti-gender opposition was assumed to be foreign to the European context, and when observed, it was associated with conservative understandings of religion in Catholic European countries like Italy, and with remnants of a problematic past in the case of Central and Eastern European countries. Interpreting these politics, anti-gender politics, as national phenomena bound by state boundaries and as attributable to specific national context particularities has been criticized by numerous students of anti-gender politics who have highlighted similarities between this type of politics and mobilization in different countries. They have demonstrated that anti-gender actors' ability to form transnational networks and disseminate their politics across borders is getting bigger and bigger through the strategic use of traditional and specifically online media. However, and I think this is important because this highlights, I'm not trying to make an argument about methodological nationalism here. What I'm trying to say, try to do is to highlight the centrality of the national and of the national that has been excluded from the production of knowledge in the Western canon. So my argument is that the ways in which anti-gender groups employ to transnationalize their politics, that they are not novel. They are based on the cooptation of the vocabulary, mobilization strategies, and other elements of movements that fight for inclusion and equality, including intersectional feminist and LGBTIQ+ movements. So, anti-gender actors present themselves as members of a movement of resistance and employ concepts such as freedom of speech, equality, democracy, and citizenship to construct and disseminate their discourses and politics. So I would add to what you were saying that they do all this to cover what they're really doing, which is their politics of death. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the south, on the highway from Nicosia to Limassol, there were these huge billboards, right? And on them there was this man, a woman, and of course a baby. And underneath it would state, mother, father, normal things. It has been impossible to find out A, who's responsible for that, and B, which is probably more interesting, who paid for that. So yes, I do agree that democratic backsliding is something in which our elected representatives and state institutions are involved in. So, how much time?
20.
20 minutes. Okay. This raises not only the question of the role of media in the construction and dissemination of anti-gender politics, as well as resistances towards them. It also raises the question of how both anti- and pro-gender and LGBTIQ+ actors understand, approach, and employ the transnational as an idea and space for political action in their respective discourses and politics. And this is something that I would like to focus on. This idea of the transnational, of Europeanization that has always been central on this island, like as a sign of sort of like reaching modernity, you know, across this sentiment across the divide. What happens vis-a-vis anti-gender politics in Cyprus, right? Because classic anti-gender politics is completely against transnationalization, and they keep talking about how to preserve the national. So, moving to dangerous cooptations and misuses. Anti-LGBTIQ+ backlash and the rise of white supremacism are concomitant, of course, with the rise of the far-right and conservative forces, as well as with democratic backsliding. Anti-gender campaigns use similar discursive strategies, which include victim-perpetrator reversal, scapegoating, and the construction of conspiracy theories. So, in what Voda calls the politics of fear, the objective is to instill fear of real or imagined dangers through the scapegoating of minorities, which are casted as the dangerous other through their homogenization and stereotypical portrayal. So we see how in some parts of Europe, the conservative right and the far-right's gender regimes are gradually being saturated by an anti-Islam rhetoric that explicitly appeals to feminist values, and we see that in the South as well. So what happens is that feminist language and achievements are selectively being used by far-right politicians, and specifically far-right women politicians, to propose an emancipatory complementarism, which is a mix of liberal and conservative notions that does not aim to challenge the structural basis of inequality, but to maintain the hierarchical organization of society and redefine the margins of feminism. This is what has been called in the literature as the writing of feminism. Let me offer another example, it's not in here. Have you read about the traffic lights in the South? The crossing lights, yeah. In case you don't know, like the icon, the little person that goes like green or red, they change it. It now wears a skirt. Gender equality. So, in sum, many scholars concur that neoliberalism and populism have given rise to anti-intersectional and exclusionary versions of feminism, namely neoliberal feminism and femonationalism that are often mutually reinforcing, converge, or work in tandem in attempts to undermine feminism through the use of references to gender and gender equality. So this is also something, this appropriation, this cooptation, this hijacking is something that we can, that we see vis-a-vis LGBTIQ plus rights as well, maybe not that much in Cyprus yet, but for example, if we turn to Puar's work that focuses on the post 9/11 war on terror USA context, we learn about this disaggregation between national gays and sexual others, which is based on invocations of Orientalist tropes in which LGBTIQ plus people themselves participate. And my LGBTIQ plus activist friends in the room can confirm that racist positions sometimes exist among community members. So, interestingly, whereas the European and the transnational may function as markers of progress and exclusion in transnational LGBTIQ plus discourses and politics, the opposite often holds true in relation to anti-gender and anti-LGBTIQ plus discourses and politics. Namely, so-called gender ideology is seen as a neo-colonial discourse and strategy that denotes value decadence and political corruption, which is exported by the West to non-Western societies. And I guess like putting relevant statements are reminiscent and an example of what I'm just saying. So this further demonstrates the importance to examine how this idea of the transnational as an idea and space for political action is being employed by anti-gender and pro-LGBTIQ actors in Cyprus in their respective politics. However, there is something, how much time do I have, Erman?
Around 10.
10? All right. Let me see what I will leave out. Okay. Right, okay. All right, okay. So, let me just take it from here. What we need in order to understand the situation on the ground and therefore develop strategies for activism and mobilization, what we need is empirical knowledge, not on involved actors. We need this kind of research that will be conducted with these actors. Which brings me to the importance of all of us involved in academia of trying to conduct participant-led research. We're being asked to come and give presentations and present our work, but I think that our work means nothing if it stays enclosed in academic silos. That's why my idea, if we want to help movements, is the following. We should stop focusing on movements as the unit of analysis in our research and start focusing on individual actors. Okay, I have another member in the audience. So, Cyprus is a funny place. Cyprus is a very funny place. Does anybody in the room remember the Modinos' story? Alekos Modinos? The criminalization of homosexuality in the south? No? Okay. Very briefly. Alekos Modinos, a Greek Cypriot gay man, educated man, rich man with connections with the political elite. He was lobbying for the decriminalization of homosexuality in the South. Nobody would support him, so he took the matter to the European Court of Human Rights, right? Which argued in favor of Modinos 1993, okay? But of course, they didn't want to change the law, because who would actually do that, right? Protests by the church, protests by religious associations outside the parliament, mayhem. In the meantime, the Dina Loizidou case, I mean, that you must know, huh? That was decided in Loizidou's favor in 1996. That's a case that has to do with, I mean, the decision on that was that Turkey and not the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is actually responsible for the fact that Loizidou couldn't access her property in the north. So the European Commission tells them, you know what, you have to change the law, otherwise forget about entering the EU. This is not, this is not a pick and choose kind of thing. Human rights is human rights. So what happened is that amidst this protest where the priests were yelling, Europeans are going to turn all of us into gays, right? They went at night and they changed the law. What I'm trying to say is the following. Europeanization was the boogeyman. 10 years later, it was the accolade, not 10, maybe more. 2004, you do remember, right? What happened? That went well, and unplanned. It was all about both sides reaching Europeanization. Now, anti-gender politics, right? Which is it's all about this, like, globalization and transnationalization have killed the natural, the organic, the traditional ways of our lives. All these women suddenly want rights instead of sit at home and have their babies. It's our flirting with the idea of transnationalization that wants me to study anti-gender politics in this country from this angle. But I want to ask you this. These are sincere, legit questions, right? Because I thought that this was going to be much more informal, to be honest. I thought I would be sitting there with you in a circle. But I want to ask you something. I will need your support addressing the following questions that arise, not because of the particularities of our country, but by most attempts to generalize theory, the employment of analytical concepts, and the findings of research, even amidst this globalizing world we're living in. One, in a context like Cyprus, between tradition and modernity, when and how could the rise of anti-gender politics be pinpointed? We all say, anti-gender, but what is it and when did it start? Namely, what makes phenomena assume the description anti-gender politics as opposed to traditional and nationalist approaches to LGBTIQ+ and gender equality, especially in this in this context which is divided along ethnic lines. It's marked by colonialism, conflict, occupation, the confrontation between ethnic nationalisms, and tensions about national and European identities, content, and boundaries, not least in relation to non-conforming genders and sexualities. what makes political and societal resistance towards feminist and LGBTIQ plus objectives different from the times of Mordinos' attempts to have homosexuality decriminalized and Cypriot women's attempts both in the south and the north to set a foot in the so-called public political sphere. Question number 2. Whereas the European and the transnational may function as markers of progress and exclusion in transnational LGBTIQ plus politics, the opposite often holds true in relation to anti-gender politics, as I said before. As I said, so-called gender ideology is seen as this neo-colonial discourse and as a strategy of the West to politically and otherwise corrupt non-corrupted states. So, how is the function of the transnational in anti-gender politics to be read and interpreted in a context where transnationalization continues to function as an affirmation of cultural superiority for both pro and anti-LGBTIQ plus political actors? 3. How are resistances towards anti-gender politics to be read, analyzed, and evaluated when, and please activists excuse me for what I'm going to say, but it's true. I have data on this. So how are resistances towards anti-gender politics to be read, analyzed, and evaluated when divisions within the LGBTIQ plus and feminist movement continue to exist and tensions between radical queer and rights-based approaches to LGBTIQ plus politics inform activist understandings of their agency and of their definitions of important, trivial, and dangerous LGBTIQ plus activism? Last question, and then I promise I'm going to zip it up. How can we read and analyze anti-gender politics and resistances in Cyprus, given employments and manifestations of exclusive intersectionality, particularly in gender equality and LGBTIQ plus movements, which are usually at the forefront of struggles against anti-gender politics? Otherwise phrased, how could or should intersectionality as an analytical tool be employed in the case of the study of pro and anti-gender LGBTIQ plus politics and mobilization in Cyprus? 4 questions, think about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kamenou, for sharing being so generous to share your preliminary research as well as the questions that we received. And also to bringing us to the local level and discussing this actually transnational issue that we are going through in these challenging times. Yeah, the time was good, and we will have about a half an hour for the questions and answers. Feel free to respond the questions, but what I suggest also is to give these questions to the afternoon parallel session, which Queer Cyprus is organizing in very related to this topic, and maybe they can also discuss this in the workshop as well. And always feel free to reach out to us and for the questions that are addressed. Now the floor is yours. We will get a couple of questions collectively, and we will try to respond them. Yeah. And before asking the question, maybe you can tell which of the speakers you are directing the question.
It's actually kind of to both of them. And maybe it's also a comment as much as it's a question. First of all, I'm deeply moved by both of your speeches. Presentations. It feels like the whole conference came into full circle today with both of your words. Yesterday we heard, the truth in the times of post-truth, the power of Pharisee, Professor Newman put. We heard from Professor Deval how designing spaces differently can be actually a source of resistance. We can rethink. And today, in my opinion, everything solidified because we talked about the reality in physicality. in recent history. So my question is maybe first to you, Professor Fominaya, because you mentioned it actually, but I want to think about the younger generation who both organizes in this, some calls it techno-fascism, the era of techno-fascism, the era of urgency, the era of where the younger generation feels like everything is falling apart. How much of it, the new movement, is related to the fact that they are rediscovering the power of to be physically connected, physically being in the same place? So maybe the causes, they know the causes, they organize, they go outside to the public space, physical public space, but at the same time, maybe it's also connected to the fact that, or how much is it connected to the fact that they feel the presence of the feminist movement there and LGBT movement there, which puts the emphasis on the fact that everybody should feel safe and should be cared. And these values actually pronounced by the very presence of these movements in the physical spaces. So I just wish that you would elaborate more on this. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. We can get one more question, I think, and then we can respond them collectively. Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask two questions?
course, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. My first question goes to Cristina. This was very inspiring. Thank you very much. My question is, I am looking at, for instance, in case of my research, like the Democratic Backsliding, anti-gender coalitions, and their feminist resistances within the case of the Turkey. And I am about to finish my fieldwork, and one of the findings is actually this ethics of care between the feminists. It's a very strong finding, very similar to the Spanish context, maybe, you know, with different effects. I would like to ask, what insights do Spanish feminists and social movements, particularly the M15 or maybe Marea feminists, as far as I remember their name, offer for understanding how on ethics of care can reshape collective political practices in other countries? I think this is very, very important. And my second question to Nayia, it's a very good talk, thank you for this. And again, you have emphasized that it's transnational character and the transnational diffusion about these movements. I totally agree, but I am so much curious about, you know, how it is shaped by the local context. You have given some clues, but what makes the case of Cyprus, and particularly southern Cyprus, distinct from, you know, this from global phenomenon? And maybe you can expand it in terms of actors, discourses, and the coalitions in order to visualize it a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to start first? Yep. Please use the microphone. If you want. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so Beran, this question about the younger generation and the physical spaces. I mean, I think physical spaces are tremendously important for activism because there's something about the experience, and I think this is why the camps were so powerful. It's there's something about the shared experience of living together. And one of the things that I found in my research was that shared experiences of camping politicized the everyday in a way that wouldn't have happened if we just go about our daily lives. So suddenly, when you think about food, you think about feeding everybody, you start to think about food in a different way. If you think about negotiating with the police and the ability to be in public space, you start thinking about public space in a different way. So all of these daily experiential things that are coming up take on a politicized meaning, and it activates a political subjectivity and awareness and consciousness raising in the people who are participating. So I think that's very powerful. I think for young people in particular, it's hard for me I mean, there are definitely youth-led movements, so there's incredibly important for them. But I think there are a different kind of camps. So on the university campuses, I think those have always been hotbeds of activism because naturally students are learning to criticize about the world and they're coming together in physical spaces and they feel like the campus rightly should belong to them to a large extent. So those physical spaces are really important. But I think there are also online spaces that I've witnessed where the communities online are actually really strong transnationally. And especially with the issue of Gaza, I have I don't know if I should become so personal, but I have a 30-year-old son. And to watch those communities educate themselves about it, they become experts in sort of Palestinian colonial history, they become experts in the law, and they share and criticize and fight back and resist against sort of anti-Semitism panics while, you know, totally fighting anti-Semitism, but at the same time, you know, really developing critiques, and it's quite remarkable. So I think they're working on multiple levels. But I think absolutely the safety and the caring and the solidarity of feminist thinking also. One of the most interesting things about my recent research was I went to South Korea, and there was many youth involved in kicking out the president who had declared martial law, basically, in Korea. And it was really remarkable how these young feminists were side by side with peasant movements and labor movements and sort of old guys and all of these different constituencies, and really understood those things to be connected. So I think feeling that connection and making those connections across different struggles and different systems of oppression that you know, not locking yourself into one silo, but really thinking about these things as a shared space, and working to make those spaces fun, even though they were very stressful. All of those things have to do also, of course, with care and sustainability and supporting people emotionally in repressive contexts and scary contexts. So I think there's a real synthesis there. So I hope that answered that a little bit, and I'll let you take it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't conducted research on this, but my feeling and understanding is that when it comes to LGBTIQ plus activism, young people get socialized, you know, virtually first. So because, you know, it's so difficult to come out, right? So people join these online groups, online movements, and then they actually join organizations, you know, like, you know, and isn't that so? I mean,
Yeah, also dating apps are really helpful.
Yeah, exactly. What makes Cyprus interesting? Okay. Most of the literature on the topic focuses on, let's call it the so-called West, with immense quotation marks, right? US, UK, Western Europe, blah, blah, blah. And then we have Central and Eastern Europe. These places have completely different historical and political legacies. I mean, for example, the legacies of communism are so much different than the legacies of colonialism and occupation and division and all those things that happened on this island. If you think about it, we're not a unicorn, really, but but it's a case study that combines so many elements that it actually allows us to examine the nuances anti-gender politics take. Because yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yes, it's transnational. Okay. What is it before they all get together through the dark web? You know, what happens on the actual ground? What does the Cypriot community, what will the Cypriot community put up with? How far can they stretch it, right? Given that we want to be European and Western and white, but we're also very traditional. We want to be secular, but we are religious. And again, I'm only talking about the South because I haven't done the research in the North, okay? Haven't done it in the South either, but I have some clue about the South. All these perplexities. A country where, like, honestly, I mean, don't get angry, but it's still debatable whether we can actually talk about a feminist movement in Cyprus. I mean, we can talk about it. We don't have the history that other countries have, right? I mean, we've missed the 60s and 70s opportunity for a feminist movement. It's after joining, at least in the South, after joining the EU that, we have this flourishing of the civil society. LGBTIQ plus organizations, after Modino's huge silence until 2011 when Accept was created. So how do we study not only anti-gender politics, but also resistances in this peculiar concept that there are so many discourses that are crossing, so many. Yeah.
Thank
Thanks.
you. We have just, yeah.
So in terms of insights, I think one of the things that was really well considered was the realization that they needed to do consciousness raising and pedagogy. Because I think it's common that when you become so aware of your own critique and analysis, you really kind of lose awareness that other people are coming from such a different starting point. So even though it's exhausting to do pedagogy, and this is something I always, feel like women shouldn't have to be doing this pedagogy. This should be everybody's job to be doing this in every space, in every classroom, and every, So it can be exhausting, but it's really necessary work to do the pedagogical work. But I also think that this notion of care and this notion of a politics of life, a politics that supports life, is something that almost anyone can relate to, right? And it connects people because everybody wants to live a full and dignified life, and they can understand that other people want that too. So I think there's a lot of entry points that can cross preconceived ideological barriers to thinking, oh, she's this, so we're not going to listen. People just go, oh, it's coming from the party I don't like or something, I'm not going to listen. So I guess developing a discourse that reaches people across ideological differences and thinking very strategically about language, I think that's also something that I found very inspiring and intelligent from the movement. And also thinking about democracy in a different way, not thinking about it in procedural terms, thinking about it in substantive terms. Like, what does it really mean to be democracy? Like, what does democracy actually look like in our imaginary? What would we like it to look like? And that it's not just about laws and rights, which are absolutely fundamental, of course, that's a starting point, but we have to move so much beyond that. And I think that's where there's a lot of work that can be done, because people say, oh yes, we're doing feminist politics, we're totally into equality for women. It's like, okay, women have had formal equality for some cases centuries, but they're still oppressed by a patriarchal system every single day, and all the indicators of research show us that that's the case, right? Every indicator you want to look at, just take the United Nations gender indicators and you will see it across every single SDG, there is a gender dimension to it. So I think getting that across, I think it's the cultural and more substantive understandings of how oppressive systems work and how they reproduce themselves But starting with material care and starting with sustainability and care and empathy and just putting forward the values that should undergird any kind of politics, whatever you want to call the politics, I think that's powerful. And in crisis situations, that can become even more, people can become more receptive to it because they understand their vulnerability and they begin to understand their interdependence. So if you can politicize that in a powerful way, in a progressive way, you can also transform people's consciousness, I think. So that's where I would be from that point. Yeah, thanks.
Can I ask you a question? Oh, there is, okay, then I will not.
What we may do, actually, yeah, we are running out of time, and I don't want to take up the time from the lunch. So if it's like last burning question, please be very brief, and maybe you also take this chance as take this opportunity to do the final words, and then we wrap up. Okay? Yep.
Thank you, Erman, for the opportunity. Hello, I would like to ask Cristina. I'll ask you the magical question. Let's say you woke up tomorrow and your wildest dreams about what you were talking about have come true, and there's no more people who are fighting for the truth being called crazy or led to hopelessness and so forth. What kind of tectonic shift would have to happen overnight for your wildest dreams in terms of, how make things more equal and so forth? What would need to happen overnight to see that tectonic shift tomorrow? Thank you.
I don't know. That's the short answer. That's a very, very deep philosophical question. I think I could spend the rest of my life contemplating. Yeah. I mean, if it's a magical thing, then of course all the false consciousness that binds all of us and all the internalized binary thinking would just disappear, and we would all wake up realizing that we are all connected to each other in, spiritually and materially. And if we really truly understood that, and we really understood and felt compassion and for other people's suffering and other people's situation, then I think we would all be different. But this is coming more probably from my Buddhist side than from my scholarly side. But both of them come together for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nayia, if you want to have also like the final words if you have, and then we close the session.
I'm so glad you didn't ask me this question.
You can still respond.
No. I mean, I'm gonna ask you the question, but let's keep it as a question to maybe discuss over lunch. What I wanted to ask is the following. I mean, you brilliantly explain how you understand and define democratic backsliding, and then you brilliantly explain how we could deal with that. My question is, why is what you described happening? Is it the plain, simple Nancy Fraser answer? It's neoliberalism, folks. Or is it, what is it that leads to democratic institutions and elected officials actually not only participating, being the major actors between this backsliding? That was my question.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. That's it.
Yeah. Thank you, and I think we will close with this question. And if you're really interested with this thematic focus, which was on democratic backsliding, anti-freedom movements, and alternative forms of resistance, there will be parallel sessions organized by NGOs in the afternoon. So right after the lunch, we will be going to these workshops, and maybe we will have more chance to discuss about these questions that were addressed. Thank you for all your contributions, as well as the participants who asked the questions and make this discussion very fruitful. Teşekkürler, efkaristo. Thank you.